In the luxurious mansion, a 6-year-old boy with Down syndrome lived under the care of his millionaire father's new girlfriend. Publicly, she showed patience and affection, but when she thought she was alone with the child, her cruel, true face emerged. The cleaner's daughter, a 7-year-old girl, decided to confront her, unaware that the millionaire was behind them, watching everything. The morning sun poured like liquid honey over the Persian rugs of the vast living room, illuminating a universe of colorful toys scattered with the happy abandon of a child. At the center of it all was Leo, 6 years old, whose almond-shaped eyes shone with pure joy as he stacked wooden blocks. Every collapsing tower was a reason not for frustration, but for a crystal-clear laugh that echoed through the mansion's silence. Helen, the housekeeper who cared for the home with the same devotion she reserved for her own heart, smiled as she dusted a silver picture frame. She knew that laugh like her favorite song. Leo was the sunshine of that house, a boy whose Down syndrome only seemed to amplify his capacity to love and find wonder in the simplest things. For Helen, who had watched him grow since he was a baby, he was proof that her employer Richard's true fortune wasn't stored in offshore accounts or tied up in stock portfolios, but ran barefoot across the cold marble floors. This melody of happiness, however, had been interrupted by dissonant notes in recent months, ever since Vanessa had moved into the mansion. In public, Richard's new girlfriend was the epitome of sweetness. She brought Leo gifts, kissed his blonde hair for the photos Richard loved to post, and spoke in a saccharine voice about how blessed she was to have this little angel in her life. Richard, a man whose brilliant business mind had made him a multi-millionaire, seemed to have a blind spot when it came to matters of the heart. He saw Vanessa's smile, heard her rehearsed words, and believed he had found the perfect family to complete his vast estate. He was so busy managing his capital, his investments, and the cash flow of his companies that he failed to notice the shadows moving in the corners of his own home. But Helen saw. She saw how Leo's shoulders would subtly tense when Vanessa entered a room, saw how the boy's laughter would die in his throat, turning into a tense silence. He, who once ran to hug anyone who offered him a smile, now sought the hem of Helen's apron, hiding his face as if seeking a safe harbor against an invisible storm. They were small things, almost imperceptible to a hurried glance. Averted eyes, a tremor in his little hand when taking a toy offered by Vanessa. To Richard, they were just childish whims. To Helen, they were alarm bells, silent sirens wailing in her soul. She knew Leo's joy was a sensitive barometer, and lately the pressure had been dropping dangerously. That morning, the scene repeated itself with painful clarity. Leo was absorbed in his construction when Vanessa's voice called from the doorway. "Good morning, my sweet boy." The change in the child was instant. The light in his eyes flickered, the tower of blocks was forgotten, and he stood up, walking slowly toward Helen, who was polishing the coffee table. He said nothing, just gripped the fabric of her uniform tightly. Vanessa approached, a perfect smile on her face. "Well now, Leo, don't you want to say good morning to Vane?" She knelt, holding out her arms. Leo only tightened his grip on Helen's uniform, his small body rigid. Richard entered the room at that moment, talking on his cell phone about dividends and profitability. He saw the scene, smiled and winked at Vanessa. "He's just being shy today," she said, standing up and smoothing down her expensive dress. "Aren't you, champ?" Helen felt Leo's body tremble. She stroked his hair, her heart aching. Later, when she was alone in the kitchen, she heard Vanessa's voice from the hallway, and the tone was completely different. It wasn't the sweet voice she used in front of Richard. It was a voice cold and sharp as broken glass. "You are going to stop this drama, do you hear me? If you keep acting like this around your father, I will take away all your toy cars, every single one." A muffled sob was the only reply. Helen froze, a dish towel in her hands. The sound stopped abruptly as Vanessa realized the kitchen door was ajar. When Helen looked, Vanessa was smiling again, but her eyes were like two chips of ice. In that instant, the housekeeper knew her fears weren't imagined. They were the terrible, silent truth. The feeling of helplessness was a stone in Helen's chest. In the days that followed, she became a vigilant shadow, her eyes tracking every interaction between Vanessa and little Leo. She observed the way Vanessa's hand would grip the boy's shoulder with unnecessary force when she thought no one was looking, or the smile that didn't reach her eyes when she praised him in front of Richard. They were microaggressions, whispered cruelties that poisoned the air of the opulent house, so full of valuables and so devoid of truth. Helen polished the shine on Richard's business trophies, buffed the family's silver heirlooms, but she felt that the deepest stain was on the people's souls, and that was one she couldn't reach with her cloth. She had to try. For Leo, she had to give voice to the boy's frightened silence. The opportunity arose on a rainy afternoon. Richard was in his office, an imposing room with book-lined walls and a panoramic view of the city skyline. He was smiling at his computer screen, where charts and numbers danced, reflecting the success of his latest business deals and the steady growth of his net worth. He had just ended a triumphant call about acquiring a new company, a move that would add several more million to his already vast fortune. Helen knocked softly on the ajar door, holding a tray with fresh coffee. "Mr. Richard, excuse me." He gestured for her to enter, his good mood evident. "Come in, Helen. Today is an excellent day. The market's in our favor." Helen placed the cup on his desk, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm happy for you, sir. It's just, I wanted to talk about Leo." Richard's smile faltered a bit. "Did something happen?" "Not exactly, sir. It's just, I've found him so quiet lately, so withdrawn. He's not the same cheerful boy he used to be. He seems frightened." She chose her words as carefully as someone walking through a minefield. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, his expression shifting from euphoria to mild impatience. "Helen, you're with Leo every day. I appreciate your concern, I really do. But children go through phases. He's adapting to Vanessa. It's natural for there to be some friction at the start. But it's been months, sir, and he seems to be getting worse. Just today, he hid in the closet when she called him to play." Helen's words came out with more urgency than she intended. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Vanessa told me he's been throwing some tantrums when he doesn't get his way. She has the patience of a saint. She tries everything. Maybe he's just testing boundaries, like all kids do." He looked at Helen with a condescending kindness, the same he used to explain finance to laymen. "You worry too much. Vanessa is amazing with him. I see it. She has a heart of gold." At that exact moment, as if in a rehearsed play, Vanessa appeared at the door, leading Leo by the hand. The boy walked with his head down, his face expressionless. "Honey, sorry to interrupt. Our little artist here made a drawing for you," she said in her sweetest voice. She placed a sheet of paper on the desk. It was a colorful scribble that Richard picked up with a fond smile. "This is beautiful. Champ." He opened his arms for a hug, but Leo remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor. Vanessa laughed softly. "He's being shy today. Come on, sweetie, give Daddy a kiss." She gently pushed him forward. Leo took a hesitant step and touched his cheek to his father's knee, a mechanical, lifeless gesture. Richard, seeing only the surface scene, stroked his hair. "Thank you, my son." He looked at Helen, a look that said, "See, everything is fine." Helen felt her stomach churn. She had lost. Her attempt to sound the alarm had been disarmed with cruel perfection. She retreated in silence, her heart heavy with defeat. Later that night, Richard gathered everyone in the living room. His face was beaming with excitement. "Family, I have great news. I closed that deal in Europe. I'll need to fly out for a conference in Geneva next week. It'll be 3 days, maybe 4. He looked at Vanessa, his face full of trust and love. I know I can go without a worry because my greatest treasure will be in the best hands in the world." Helen looked at Leo, who was huddled on the sofa, and a chill of dread ran down her spine. 3 days, alone with her. The thought was unbearable. The night after Richard's travel announcement was one of the longest of Helen's life. She tossed and turned in her small, tidy room at the back of the mansion. The sound of a light rain tapping against the window serving as a soundtrack to her turbulent thoughts. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Leo's face, the light of his joy being snuffed out like a candle in a gale. Her fear for him was a physical presence, a cold knot in her stomach that refused to loosen. How could she protect this innocent boy when his own father, the man who built a business empire and amassed a fortune in assets, was blind to the danger living under his own roof? She felt like a lone sentry guarding a treasure the king himself had forgotten. What good was so much money, so many assets, if the most precious one was at risk? At dawn, exhausted and without a solution, she went to the modest apartment where her 7-year-old daughter, Laura, spent the week with her grandmother. Seeing her daughter's serene, sleeping face was like a balm. Laura was a little dynamo of empathy and courage, a girl who always stood up for the smaller kids at the playground and shared her lunch without anyone having to ask. And then an idea, as fragile as a spider's thread but the only one she had, began to form in her mind. What if Laura could be her eyes and ears? What if the presence of another child could serve as a shield, or at least a distraction from Vanessa's cruelty? It was a risk. She would be putting her own daughter in a potentially hostile situation, but the image of Leo, huddled and silent, overrode all her fears. It was a risk she had to take. On the eve of the trip, Helen found Richard in his bedroom, finishing his packing. He was on the phone, gesturing as he discussed the price of some cryptocurrencies and the importance of diversifying investments. She waited patiently until he hung up, his gaze still distant, focused on future profits. "Mr. Richard," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "with you traveling, I'll have a lot more work to make sure everything is in order. I'll probably need to stay later. I was wondering if it would be possible to bring my daughter, Laura, to spend these days here. That way she wouldn't be alone with her grandmother for so long and, well, she and Leo adore each other. Maybe it would do him good to have some company." Richard looked at her, his mind still processing numbers and strategies. Helen's proposal seemed purely logistical to him. "Laura, of course, your girl. An excellent idea, Helen." He smiled, pleased with the simple solution. "Great. That way Leo has someone to play with and you don't have to worry." "Perfect." He turned to call for Vanessa, who entered the room with a radiant smile. "Darling, Helen had a great idea. Her daughter, Laura, is going to spend these few days with us to keep Leo company." For a split second, the blink of an eye, Helen saw Vanessa's mask slip. A shadow of irritation crossed her face, so fast it was almost imperceptible, but Helen saw it. Then the smile returned, brighter than ever. "But that's wonderful. I love Laura. She's such a sweetheart. They're going to have a blast, aren't they, my love?" She bent down and gave a loud kiss to the cheek of Leo, who stood beside her, impassive. The next day, the farewell was brief. Richard was late for the airport. He hugged Leo tightly, promising to bring back an incredible gift. He gave Vanessa a passionate kiss and waved to Helen and Laura, who had just arrived, hand in hand with her mother. "Be good," he said with a wink, before getting into the black town car that was waiting for him. The mansion's front door closed with a heavy, definitive click, the sound echoing through the silent entrance hall. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Vanessa turned. The loving smile she had for Richard was completely gone. In its place was a cold, impatient expression. She looked at the two children holding hands, then at Helen, and her eyes seemed to calculate the weight of this new, unwanted obstacle. As soon as the sound of Richard's car faded into the distance, the atmosphere in the mansion palpably shifted. The warmth of the family farewell was replaced by a chill that seemed to emanate directly from Vanessa. She turned, the smile still an echo on her lips, but her eyes were calculating. She looked at Laura, a girl with neat braids and curious eyes, who was tightly gripping her mother's hand. "So, Laura, nice to have you here," Vanessa said, her tone polished but devoid of any genuine warmth. "I hope you won't be too much trouble." The phrase, delivered with a slight smile, hung in the air, a veiled warning. Helen felt Laura's hand squeeze hers even tighter and gave a gentle squeeze back, a silent signal of reassurance. "She's a very quiet girl, Miss Vanessa," Helen replied, keeping her voice calm and respectful. Leo, who had been motionless until then, seemed to awaken at Laura's presence. His almond-shaped eyes met the girl's, and a small, almost shy smile curved his lips. Laura, with the pure intuition of a child, let go of her mother's hand and took a step toward him. "Hi, Leo. Want to show me your dinosaurs?" Her voice was clear and kind. Leo nodded, an almost imperceptible movement, but one full of meaning. He took her hand, and together the two small children headed toward the playroom, leaving the two women behind. Vanessa watched the scene with an unreadable expression before turning to Helen. "I have some calls to make. Keep the children occupied and please, no messes. Richard may have built his empire on the chaos of the stock market, but I like order in this house." With that, she went up the stairs, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble. In the playroom, a friendship blossomed with the speed and purity that only childhood allows. Laura didn't see Leo's Down syndrome. She saw a friend. She didn't care that his words sometimes took a while to come out, or that he expressed himself more with gestures and sounds. She understood him perfectly. They built forts out of pillows, raced toy cars across the rug, and gave funny names to each of the plastic dinosaurs. For the first time in months, Helen heard Leo's genuine laugh, not the loud, free giggle of before, but a more contained, almost secret sound, as if he were afraid of being overheard. Laura was the antidote. Her cheerful, non-judgmental presence seemed to dilute the poison that had settled in the boy's heart. Helen, as she cleaned the nearby rooms, kept her ears open. She could hear the children's whispers and giggles, a sound that warmed her soul, but her radar was tuned for another sound, Vanessa's footsteps. Later, at snack time, the tension returned. Vanessa came down to the kitchen, where Helen was preparing sandwiches and juice. "They're too quiet. What are they up to?" she asked, her tone heavy with suspicion. "They're just playing, Ms. Vanessa, eating the snack I made." Vanessa walked into the breakfast nook and found the two children sitting at the table, eating in silence. Laura, upon seeing her, gave a polite smile. Leo, on the other hand, shrank in his chair, his sandwich forgotten in his hand. Vanessa got a glass of water, her eyes fixed on Leo. "You're getting jelly all over your shirt," she said, her voice low and harsh, believing Helen couldn't hear from the kitchen. "How many times do I have to tell you to eat properly? You're such a little piggy." The word piggy was said with a contempt that made Laura lift her head, her eyes wide. She saw Leo's mouth tremble, and a single, silent tear roll down his cheek. He made no sound, just let the tear fall onto his plate. Laura looked from Leo to Vanessa, and on her young face an expression of profound injustice formed. She said nothing, but her eyes, fixed on Vanessa, were the most eloquent of accusations. Vanessa felt the stare and turned to the girl. "What are you looking at? Eat your snack." But Laura didn't look away. She just watched, engraving the scene in her memory, courage growing in her small heart. And in that moment, in the silence of the kitchen, she witnessed the truth her mother so feared. That incident in the kitchen was a watershed moment for Laura. The girl, who until then was just there for company, silently took on the role of protector. She wasn't naive. The cruelty in Vanessa's tone had been as clear to her as the colors in her crayon box. She saw Leo's tear and felt as if it had fallen on her own heart. From that moment on, she became her new friend's shadow. Where Leo went, Laura went. If he picked up a book, she sat beside him, even if she couldn't read all the words. If he went into the garden, she followed, inventing games that kept them always together, always within her sight. It was a tacit alliance, a silent promise that he would no longer face the storm alone. Vanessa, meanwhile, seemed increasingly irritated by the girl's constant presence. Laura was an obstacle, an unwanted witness who disrupted her methods of discipline. She couldn't use her cutting tone or her disguised pinches with the housekeeper's daughter always nearby. Her frustration grew with each passing hour, manifesting in sharp comments and disapproving glares. "Can't you two be separated for a second? So clingy," she remarked on one occasion, with a false playful tone that didn't fool either child. Helen watched from a distance, her heart torn between pride in her daughter's courage and a growing fear of what Vanessa might do when her patience ran out. She was betting everything on the protection a 7-year-old could offer, and that bet felt increasingly risky. On the second night of Richard's absence, Laura had an idea. She had seen Vanessa using Richard's tablet for online shopping. The device was often left forgotten on the living room sofa. Laura, who was tech-savvy like most kids her age, knew how to turn it on and, more importantly, how to use the camera. While Vanessa was upstairs on a long phone call, Laura acted. "Leo, want to play movie spies?" she whispered. Leo looked at her, confused. Laura picked up the tablet. "We're going to be spies. We'll hide the camera to film the villain." She didn't have to explain who the villain was. Leo understood immediately. His eyes widened, a mix of fear and admiration for his friend's boldness. With the skill of someone who knows every hiding spot in a house, Leo helped her find the perfect place, behind a stack of art magazines on a corner table, with the camera lens peeking through a small gap. The view perfectly captured the main sofa and the area where Leo usually played on the rug. Laura started the recording, and they moved away, returning to their toys as if nothing had happened. The girl's heart was pounding in her chest. She didn't know exactly what she hoped to capture, but she felt with a visceral certainty that she needed proof. Something the adults couldn't ignore or call childish imagination. She was creating her own insurance policy, not with money or stocks, but with digital truth. Later, Vanessa came downstairs, her bad mood obvious. "Bath time, both of you," she ordered, without even looking at them. "Upstairs now." As they climbed the stairs, Leo stumbled on the last step. He wasn't hurt, but he let out a small yelp of surprise. Vanessa, who was right behind him, grabbed him by the arm. "Can't you even walk up the stairs properly? It's unbelievable how clumsy you are. Pay attention." Her voice was a venomous hiss, uttered in a whisper so Helen's in the kitchen wouldn't hear. Leo shrank back, his eyes filling with tears. Laura, standing at the top of the stairs, saw everything. She said nothing, but her gaze met Leo's, and in it she conveyed a message. "I saw, I'm here, we're going to show them." The tablet, forgotten in the living room, continued to record the empty silence, but Laura knew it was only a matter of time before the hidden camera captured the truth in all its ugliness. The next day, the last before Richard's return, an almost electric tension hung in the mansion's air. Vanessa seemed to be at the end of her rope. Laura's constant presence, acting as Leo's little bodyguard, prevented her from exercising her subtle and cruel control. She watched them playing in the garden through the kitchen window, her jaw tight. 2 children, one belonging to a man with a genius for business and the other with the cunning of a survivor, were dismantling her carefully constructed plan to establish herself as the perfect matriarch of this empire. Her future, tied to Richard's vast wealth, his investments, his funds, and the promise of a life of luxury, depended on her ability to control the boy. and the housekeeper's daughter was ruining everything, she decided to change tactics. If she couldn't intimidate the boy, perhaps she could discredit the girl. It was time to plant the seed of doubt in Richard's mind before he even arrived. The first accident happened around lunchtime. Vanessa called Laura to the kitchen with a falsely sweet voice. "Laura, honey, can you help me take this juice to the table in the garden?" She handed the girl a heavy glass pitcher, filled to the brim with orange juice. The pitcher was clearly too heavy for a 7-year-old's hands. Laura, wanting to be helpful, held it with both hands, concentrating. As she passed through the glass door, Vanessa subtly tripped on the rug, bumping Laura's arm. The pitcher flew from the girl's hands, shattering on the stone patio and scattering shards and juice everywhere. Laura froze, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh my God, Laura!" Vanessa shouted, her tone instantly shifting from sweetness to shocked reprimand. "Look what you've done! That pitcher was Richard's grandmother's. I told you to be careful." Leo, who saw everything from the lawn, ran over to Laura, his face twisted with worry. Helen came running from the kitchen, alerted by the crash. "What happened?" she asked, already grabbing a broom and dustpan. "Your daughter," Vanessa said, pointing an accusing finger, completely careless. "She broke a priceless piece of crystal. I don't know what's gotten into her. She's so agitated, so destructive today." Laura tried to say that Vanessa had pushed her, but the words wouldn't come out. She just looked at her mother, her eyes filled with tears of injustice. As Vanessa continued her performance as the victim, the second incident was even more calculated. Later, as the children were drawing in the living room, Vanessa approached with Richard's tablet in hand. "Who's been messing with my tablet?" she asked, her voice cold. She showed the screen to Helen. Several apps were open, and there were files with strange names. "Was it you, Laura? You know you're not allowed to touch Richard's things. This is for work. It has important information about the stock market, about his business deals. You could have deleted something worth millions." Laura shook her head, mute. She had used the tablet to record, but she hadn't touched anything else. It was obvious Vanessa had created the mess to frame her. "She's lying, Ms. Vanessa," Helen said, her voice firm. "Laura knows not to touch what isn't hers." "Oh, really, Helen? Then how do you explain this?" Vanessa retorted, venom dripping from her words. "Maybe you don't know your daughter as well as you think. She's been a problem since she got here." She turned and left the room, leaving a heavy silence behind. Laura ran into her mother's arms, sobbing, "It wasn't me. Mommy, I swear she's lying." Helen hugged her tightly, her heart aching with anger and helplessness. "I know, my love. I believe you." She looked at Leo, who was watching the scene with eyes full of sad understanding. He walked over and touched Laura's arm, a gesture of solidarity. In that moment, the alliance between the two children solidified further, forged in the fire of injustice. But Vanessa's strategy was in motion. The seeds of doubt had been planted. When Richard returned, he would find the narrative of a problem child and a patient, suffering girlfriend. And the tablet, with the recording that could expose everything, was now back in Vanessa's hands. The morning of Richard's return dawned grey and oppressive, the sky outside the window mirroring the atmosphere inside the mansion. Laura had barely slept. Vanessa's accusations echoed in her mind, leaving a bitter taste of injustice. She felt small and powerless, a toy soldier trying to fight a giant. Helen hugged her before starting her work, her eyes conveying a message of unshakable faith. "Don't worry, my love. The truth always finds a way." But for the first time, Laura wondered if that was really true. Vanessa's lie seemed so much stronger, so much more convincing. Worst of all was the fear of having lost her only proof. The tablet. She had seen it in Vanessa's hands the night before, a war trophy the woman brandished with a triumphant smile. Her brave spy plan seemed to have crumbled to dust. Meanwhile, in her lavish bedroom, Vanessa felt in control. The strategy of painting Laura as a problem child was working perfectly. She had already sent Richard a text full of sighs and sad emojis lamenting the little disasters caused by the girl's uncontrollable energy. She was building her defense before there was even an accusation. With renewed confidence, she picked up Richard's tablet, planning to erase any trace of Laura's use, maybe even discover some non-existent damage to seal the narrative. She opened the photo gallery to begin the cleanup, and that's when her world turned upside down. There it was, the last item on the list. A video file. Curious. She opened it. The image that appeared on the screen was grainy, filmed from a low angle, but unmistakable. It was the living room. She saw herself enter the frame, her face twisted in a scowl of impatience, and then she heard her own voice. Not the sweet melody she used for Richard, but the hissing, cruel whisper she reserved for Leo. She saw herself grabbing the boy's arm, calling him clumsy, the words dripping poison. The recording was short, just a few seconds of the scene on the stairs, but it was enough. It was dynamite. The blood drained from her face. For a moment, panic suffocated her. The housekeeper's daughter, that insignificant little brat, had recorded her. The audacity of it left her breathless. After the panic came fury, a cold, calculating rage. She wasn't dealing with a misbehaving child. She was dealing with an enemy. Her finger trembled over the trash icon, but she hesitated. Deleting it was the first, most obvious step, but it wasn't enough. The knowledge of what Laura had done changed everything. It was no longer enough to discredit the girl. She had to remove her and her mother. She had to rip this threat out by the roots before it could sprout again. She deleted the video, making sure it was permanently removed from the device's memory. Then she took a deep breath, recomposing her mask of serenity. The game had changed. The stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about securing her place beside a rich man. It was about survival. It was about protecting the life of luxury, the access to the fortune she already considered her own. Later that day, she found Laura alone in the upstairs hallway, looking at a painting. Leo was in the bath under Helen's supervision. It was the perfect opportunity. Vanessa approached silently, her footsteps muffled by the runner. Laura sensed her presence and turned, her body instinctively stiffening. Vanessa knelt, bringing herself to the girl's level, a thin, dangerous smile on her lips. "You know, Laura," she began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, "children who make up stories, who meddle where they don't belong, sometimes they cause very big problems for the people they love." She paused, her eyes locking onto Laura's. "Your mother really likes her job here, doesn't she? It would be a shame if she lost it because of a lying little girl." Vanessa's words hit Laura with the force of a punch. A lying little girl. The veiled threat, so cruelly aimed at her mother's job, sucked all the air from her lungs. She looked at Vanessa's smiling face, a smile that didn't reach the cold, calculating eyes, and understood the depth of the malice she was facing. This was no longer a spy game, it was a silent war, and her mother was a hostage. Fear, icy and paralyzing, replaced her courage. She, who had felt so brave with her secret plan, now found herself cornered. The video, her only weapon, was gone, and now her family's security was at stake. She just nodded, unable to form a word, and fled down the hall, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the days that followed, a new dynamic settled over the mansion. Laura became a shadow of her former self. She still stayed close to Leo, out of instinct and affection, but the flame of her rebellion had been extinguished. She kept her head down when Vanessa was near, avoiding her gaze at all costs. She hadn't told her mother about the threat, the weight of the secret crushing her small shoulders. How could she admit that her attempt to help had jeopardized her family's livelihood? Helen, for her part, noticed the change. She saw her daughter's joy replaced by a somber anxiety, but attributed it to Vanessa's fabricated accidents. and the tension of waiting for Richard's return. Leo, with his keen sensitivity, sensed the shift in his friend. He saw the sadness in Laura's eyes and didn't understand why. He tried to cheer her up, bringing her his favorite dinosaurs or pulling her by the hand to the swing set in the garden. In one of those moments, sitting side by side on the grass, he placed his small hand over hers. "Laura sad?" he asked, his voice soft. Laura looked at him, at the genuine concern on his face, and the tears she had been holding back so forcefully finally escaped. She cried silently, shaking her head, unable to explain the complexity of the situation. Leo didn't need words. He just sat there, holding her hand, offering the quiet comfort of his presence. Their friendship, born of shared joy, now deepened in mutual pain, creating an even stronger bond between them. Richard returned at the end of the week, bringing with him a gust of energy and normalcy. He was glowing from the success of his trip. The deals he closed had significantly increased his capital, and he couldn't wait to share the good news. He walked into the house laden with gifts, a wide smile on his face. "Daddy's home," he announced. Leo ran into his arms, a tight, a genuine hug that warmed Richard's heart. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. Vanessa greeted him with a passionate kiss, playing the role of the loving girlfriend flawlessly. Laura and Helen watched from a distance, two silent spectators in this family's theater. Later that night, after the children were in bed, Vanessa put her plan into action. Sitting next to Richard on the leather sofa, she sighed, a sound carefully calibrated for exhaustion and sadness. "Honey, I need to talk to you about something," she began. "I didn't want to worry you while you were traveling, but we had some issues with Laura." Richard frowned. "Issues? What do you mean?" And then Vanessa wove her web of lies. She described the broken pitcher, the messed-up tablet, painting Laura as a careless and disobedient child. I tried to be patient, I swear, but she's difficult. And Helen defends her blindly. I'm worried her influence isn't good for Leo." She looked at him, her eyes filled with false concern. "I just want what's best for our boy, and I'm not sure this is the best situation for him." The seed of discord, planted days before, was now being watered with poison. Vanessa's words fell on the fertile ground of Richard's tired mind. He, who had spent days immersed in spreadsheets, negotiations, and the complex world of financial assets, wanted to come home to peace, not domestic problems. Vanessa's version was simple, direct, and most importantly, didn't require him to question his own judgment. It was easier to believe a 7-year-old girl was difficult than to confront the terrifying possibility that the woman he loved was cruel to his son. "I understand your concern, darling," he said, stroking her hand. "I'll talk to Helen tomorrow. Maybe Laura needs firmer boundaries. Don't worry, we'll sort this out." Vanessa smiled, a smile of victory. The first battle was won. She had successfully framed the problem not as an attack on Leo, but as Laura's behavioral issue. The next morning, the mood in the mansion was heavy. Helen felt it in the air, in the way Richard greeted her with a formal "good morning," without his usual smile. He called her into his office, the same room where, weeks before, she had tried in vain to warn him. He closed the door, a gesture that made Helen's heart run cold. "Helen," he began, his tone serious, "Vanessa told me about some incidents that happened while I was away. The broken pitcher, my tablet. She's concerned about Laura's behavior." Helen felt the floor disappear from beneath her. It was just as she had feared. "Mr. Richard, with all due respect, that's not how it happened. The pitcher, it was an accident, Ms. Vanessa caused, and Laura didn't mess with your files." Richard sighed, a sound of impatience. "Helen, I know you want to defend your daughter. It's natural. But Vanessa would have no reason to make these things up. She only wants what's best for Leo. She feels that Laura might be a bad influence, a little too wild for him." The word wild hit Helen like a slap. Her daughter, Her kind and brave girl being described that way. "That's not true," she protested, her voice trembling with indignation. "Laura is the best friend Leo has ever had. She protects him." Richard held up a hand. "Enough. I don't want to argue. I just want you to talk to Laura. I don't want any more accidents happening in this house. Understood?" He dismissed her with a wave, turning back to his computer screen, where charts on his stock market performance seemed much simpler to understand than the emotional complexities of his own home. Helen left the office feeling defeated and furious. Vanessa's trap was perfect. She had turned the victim into the culprit, the protector into a threat. How could she fight against that? Later, she found Laura in the garden, pushing Leo on the swing. The scene was so pure, so full of innocence, that it contrasted painfully with the ugliness of the conversation she'd just had. Laura was laughing as Leo giggled, his head thrown back, his feet dangling in the air. It was the picture of happiness. But Helen knew that picture was under threat. Vanessa was watching them from the window, her arms crossed, a dark expression on her face. She was gaining ground, poisoning Richard's perception, isolating Helen and her daughter. The fear Laura felt was now shared by her mother. Helen began to wonder if her presence, and her daughter's, wasn't ultimately making things worse for Leo. Perhaps, in trying to protect him, they had only provoked the predator's wrath, making her more dangerous, more determined to get rid of them, to have a clear path. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. She looked at the two children, their laughter floating on the afternoon breeze, and a painful decision began to form in her heart. Maybe the only way to protect Leo was to leave. Maybe she had to sacrifice her job, her stability, so that Vanessa's attention would shift away from him. The thought made her sick, but that boy's safety was worth more than any salary, more than anything. The idea of leaving, of abandoning Leo to his fate, was like a burning coal in Helen's chest. She spent her nights sleepless, weighing her options. But they all seemed to lead to a dead end. If she stayed, Vanessa's hostility towards her and Laura would only escalate, and Richard, blinded by love, would likely side with his girlfriend. If she left, Leo would lose his only two allies, leaving him completely vulnerable. The dilemma consumed her. During the day, she performed her duties with mechanical precision, a forced smile on her face, but inside, she was fighting a silent battle. She felt trapped in a house of cards, where any false move could bring everything crashing down. Meanwhile, Laura, still haunted by Vanessa's threat, tried to deal with her own conflict. Fear for her mother's job silenced her, but love for Leo compelled her to act. She could no longer be the fearless guardian she once was, but she found other, more subtle ways to protect him. She invented games that kept them in rooms where Helen was working, ensuring they were never truly alone with Vanessa. She became an expert at creating diversions, drawing Vanessa's attention to herself with trivial questions whenever she sensed the woman was about to take her impatience out on Leo. They were small guerrilla tactics, fought on the battlefield of a luxury mansion. The tension reached a new peak a few days later. Richard was planning an important dinner at home for some investors. He wanted to present Vanessa as the perfect hostess, the future lady of his empire. For Vanessa, it was her coronation night. Everything had to be flawless. She spent the day giving orders, her voice sharp, her patience non-existent. Leo, sensing the anxiety in the air, was more restless than usual. He spilled a glass of milk in the kitchen, and Vanessa's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. "Can't you pay attention to anything?" she hissed, grabbing a cloth and violently wiping up the mess. "I'm trying to organize an event that could bring in millions in new investments for your father, and you're just getting in the way." Leo flinched, his eyes welling with tears. Laura, standing in the doorway, saw the scene and her heart pounded. Fear and courage waged a battle inside her. "It was an accident," she said, her voice a thread. Vanessa whirled on her, her eyes blazing. I stay out of things that don't concern you, girl. Go tidy your room, it's a mess, and take him with you. I don't want to see him down here until dinner time. She pushed Leo toward Laura. Go! The two children went upstairs in silence. In Leo's room, Laura hugged him. She's mean, Leo whispered. His voice choked. I know, Laura replied, her own throat tight. But we're stronger. She wasn't sure she believed those words, but she needed him to. That night, as the guests arrived and the sound of laughter and talk about capital markets and cryptocurrencies filled the downstairs, the two children were in their own world. Laura had found Richard's old voice recorder, a simple device he used to dictate business ideas. She didn't know how, but she felt she needed a new weapon. The tablet had failed, but maybe simplicity could be her ally. She showed Leo how it worked. If she's mean again, she whispered, we push this red button. It was a fragile, almost childish plan, but it was all they had. It was a small act of defiance against the darkness surrounding them, a promise that they would not surrender without a fight. The dinner party was a resounding success. The guests, tycoons and investors with net worths totaling in the billions, were charmed. Richard beamed with pride, not just for the profitability charts he discussed with enthusiasm, but for the stunning woman by his side. Vanessa was the personification of elegance and charm. She floated among the guests, crystal glass in hand, discussing art and philanthropy with impressive ease. No one there could imagine the darkness that hid behind that perfect smile. Helen, serving hors d'oeuvres, watched the performance with a knot in her stomach. It was like watching a play where only she knew the true character of the lead actress. Upstairs, Leo and Laura listened to the soft music and distant laughter. Vanessa's order to stay in the room was clear, but Leo was thirsty. Water, he whispered to Laura. Laura hesitated. Going downstairs was risky, but Leo's face was flushed, and he looked uncomfortable. Okay, she said, taking his small hand. We'll go really slowly, down the back stairs. No one will see us. They slipped out of the room, their bare feet silent in the hallway. The service staircase led directly to a corridor near the kitchen. The plan was simple: get a glass of water and return unnoticed. But as they reached the end of the hall, they heard voices. Richard and Vanessa had stepped away from the main group for a moment and were in the butler's pantry near the kitchen entrance. Everything is perfect, darling. You're incredible, Richard was saying, his voice full of admiration. I just do my best for you and for our little one, Vanessa replied in her sweetest voice. Speaking of him, I think we should consider that special school I mentioned, a boarding school. It would be so good for him, for his development. He'd have specialists around him all the time. Richard sounded surprised. A boarding school? But Vane, he's so little, and I barely see him as it is. I know, my love, she continued, her voice a manipulative velvet. But it's for his own good. Here, with the chaos of your life, of your business, and with not so good influences like the housekeeper's daughter, there he'd be protected, focused. Hidden in the shadows of the hallway, Laura and Leo heard every word. Laura felt her blood run cold. A boarding school. They wanted to send Leo away. They wanted to get rid of him. She looked at Leo's face and saw the confusion and fear stamped in his eyes. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood the essence. He understood they were talking about sending him far away. His small hand squeezed Laura's tightly, seeking safety. In that moment, Laura's fear transformed into a cold, determined fury. The threat to her mother's job was one thing, but the threat to exile her friend, to tear him from his home and his father, was something else entirely. It was a line that could not be crossed. They retreated in silence. The water forgotten, Laura's heart beating like a war drum. She put Leo back to bed, but the girl who returned to her own room was not the same one who had gone down the stairs. The frightened toy soldier was gone. In her place stood a warrior. She no longer had a plan. She no longer had a secret weapon, but she had something more powerful. the truth and the absolute certainty of what was right. She didn't know how, but she was going to expose Vanessa, no matter the cost, no matter the threat. She looked out the window at the party continuing below, a world of wealth and lies, and made a silent promise to the night. Vanessa's party was about to end. The opportunity Laura didn't know she was waiting for arrived 3 days later, under a clear blue sky. Richard was scheduled to be in day-long meetings downtown, discussing business expansion and the allocation of new investment funds. Vanessa, believing she had the day to herself, decided to spend the afternoon in the garden, relaxing by the pool. For her, it was the calm before the final storm, the last push to convince Richard about the boarding school idea. Helen was busy on the other side of the property, helping the gardener with new plantings, and Laura and Leo had the backyard to themselves. It was the perfect setting for disaster. The turning point began with something small, a puzzle. Leo was trying to fit the last piece of a large world map puzzle onto the stone patio, but the piece wouldn't go in. He grunted in frustration, a low, guttural sound. Vanessa, who was lying on a lounge chair reading a fashion magazine, lifted her sunglasses, irritation plain on her face. "Can you make less noise? I'm trying to read." Leo ignored her, focused on his task. He tried to force the piece, and it snapped in his hands. A loud sob of despair escaped him. That was the last straw for Vanessa. She shot up from her chair and marched over to him, snatching the 2 halves of the piece from his hands. "You are unbelievable. Can't you do anything right? Anything?" Her voice was a low, venomous hiss, but it was loaded with months of pent-up frustration. "Look what you did. You ruined it, like you always do. Sometimes I wonder if you try to be so slow, so problematic." The words fell on Leo like stones. He shrank back. The cry caught in his throat, tears streaming down his face. "Your father spends a fortune on you, on your toys, on everything, and this is how you thank him, by being a dead weight. That boarding school will be the best thing that could ever happen to you. There, they'll teach you how not to be a burden." Laura, who had been building a sandcastle a few feet away, heard every word. The blood boiled in her veins. The promise she had made to herself that night echoed in her mind. No more. She stood up, sand falling from her clothes, and marched toward them. Her heart was pounding, but her feet were steady. She placed herself between Vanessa and Leo, a small 7-year-old human shield. She looked up, staring into the face of the tall, furious woman. "Don't talk to my friend like that." Her voice came out clear, loud, and without a trace of hesitation. "You're a mean bully!" Vanessa was stunned for a second, caught off guard by the girl's audacity. Then her face contorted into a mask of rage. "How dare you!" she hissed, taking a step forward. "You insolent little brat! I warned you, didn't I? You want your mother to be out on the street. Is that what you want?" The threat, which had once paralyzed her, now only fueled her courage. "Go ahead and fire her!" Laura yelled, tears of anger now streaming down her face. "My mom can get another job, but Leo doesn't have another family. You are not sending him away. He is not a burden. You are the burden." The confrontation was so intense, the air so thick with emotion, that neither of them noticed the figure standing at the glass door leading to the garden. Neither of them heard the soft click of the door opening. Richard, whose meeting had been cancelled at the last minute, had decided to come home early to surprise his son, and he arrived at the exact moment to witness the scene in its entirety. He saw the cruel face of his girlfriend, heard her poisonous words about the boarding school, about his son being a burden. And then he saw the brave little daughter of his housekeeper stand in the way, risking everything to defend his boy. Reality hit him not like a wave, but like a tsunami, destroying in seconds the castle of lies he had allowed to be built around him. The silence that followed Laura's shout was deafening. Vanessa froze, her face pale with shock and horror as she saw Richard standing there, his expression an unreadable mix of pain, fury, and a deep, devastating disillusionment. Her world, built on a foundation of deceit, crumbled in that instant. "Richard, honey, it's not what it looks like," she stammered. The transformation from villain to victim instant and desperate. This girl, she twists everything. She was being aggressive with Leo, and I was just... But the words died in her throat. The lie, so effective for so long, now sounded hollow and pathetic in the face of the raw truth he had just witnessed. Richard didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on his son, cowering behind Laura, his face bathed in silent tears. He saw the terror in Leo's eyes, a terror that he, in his neglect and blind trust, had allowed to flourish in his own home. The weight of his failure as a father hit him with a physical force, leaving him breathless. He walked slowly across the patio, each step seeming to weigh a ton. He knelt in front of the two children, completely ignoring the woman trembling a few feet away. He reached out a hand to Leo, but the boy flinched, seeking Laura's protection. That small gesture was the final dagger in Richard's heart. His son was afraid of him, or at least no longer trusted him to be his protector. "It's okay now, champ," Richard said, his voice choked, breaking for the first time in years. "Daddy's here. Daddy's really here now." He then turned to Laura, whose tears of anger had turned into quiet sobs. He looked at this tiny girl, who had shown more courage and insight than a powerful billionaire, ever had. "Thank you," he whispered, the word heavy with the weight of an unpayable debt. "You were so brave." Helen, alerted by the shouting, came running, her face a mask of panic. She saw the scene, Richard kneeling, the children crying, Vanessa paralyzed, and understood everything. Richard stood and finally faced Vanessa. There were no shouts, no dramatic accusations, just a cold, deadly calm. "Pack your things," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "I want you out of my house in 1 hour." "Richard, please, listen to me," she begged. "Out," he repeated, the tone final and non-negotiable. As Vanessa walked up the stairs, defeated, Richard turned to Helen. "I'm so sorry," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was overwhelming. "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you, that I didn't see. I failed him. I failed all of you." In the next hour, the house underwent a purification. Vanessa left, dragging her suitcases, not daring to look back. The door closed behind her, and it was as if the entire house could breathe again. Richard sat on the ground in the garden with Leo and Laura. He didn't try to force a hug or ask for forgiveness. He just sat there, present, letting his son set the pace of their reunion. Slowly, Leo, sensing the change in the atmosphere, moved closer. He rested his head on his father's shoulder, a gesture of forgiveness and acceptance that Richard didn't feel he deserved, but which he received as the most valuable gift of his life. He held his son, and for the first time, he also hugged Laura, forming a small circle of healing on the patio. The first and most important victory had been won. The source of the suffering had been removed. But the journey to rebuild trust and heal the invisible wounds was just beginning. The 3 weeks following that confrontation in the garden were a period of profound transformation in the mansion that had, for so long, been a stage for material wealth and emotional poverty. Richard cancelled all his non-essential travel and meetings. He learned that the greatest investment he could make wasn't in the stock market or in cryptocurrencies, but in time. Time to eat breakfast with his son, to push him on the swing, to patiently help him assemble the broken puzzle, gluing the piece back together with a care that was, in truth, an act of mending his own neglect. He rediscovered the melody of Leo's laugh, and he worked every day to ensure it would never be silenced again. Leo's trust, once shattered, blossomed under the constant sun of his father's presence and attention. Helen was promoted. She was no longer just the housekeeper. She became the house manager and, more importantly, Leo's primary caregiver, a role she had already performed with her heart, but which was now recognized with respect and a generous financial compensation. Richard insisted that Laura and her mother move into the mansion, if they so wished. A guest suite was transformed into a 7-year-old's dream bedroom, and Laura became a permanent, beloved presence in Leo's life, no longer a visitor, but a soul sister. Their friendship, forged in adversity, became the beating heart of their new home. They were inseparable, a constant reminder of the courage born from kindness. On a sunny afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after Vanessa's departure, the scene in the garden was the antithesis of the drama that had unfolded there. Leo and Laura were running on the grass, their laughter echoing freely, without fear. Helen watched them from a chair on the veranda, a serene smile on her face. Richard came and sat beside her, not as boss and employee, but as two adults united by a common purpose. "I will never be able to thank you enough, Helen," he said, looking at the children. "Not you, and not her. You already have, Mr. Richard," she replied, her voice soft. By doing what was right, Richard had set up a trust fund in Laura's name, a substantial nest egg to ensure her education and future. The only way he knew how to translate his immense gratitude into something tangible. But he knew, and Helen did too, that the real reward wasn't the money. It was right there, in the happiness of those two children. It was in the lesson that he, the multi-millionaire, had learned from his housekeeper's daughter, that true wealth is not measured in dollars or gold, but in the courage to protect the vulnerable and in the strength of human bonds. The mansion, once cold and silent, was now filled with life, love, and above all, security. Leo, the boy who had suffered in silence, found his voice and his joy, knowing he had a father who truly saw him and a guardian angel disguised as a best friend. Laura, the girl who faced down a giant, discovered a strength within herself that would guide her for the rest of her life. And Richard, the father who almost lost everything that mattered, finally understood that no business success, no fortune, would ever be worth more than the well-being and trust of his son. The home was at last complete.